Hey everybody, here is a lecture on hemodynamics. This lecture should cover the basics of different types of shock and the pressures that we use to treat them. And this will be on the exam too. So we're going to look at So to start, let's just look at physiology. Fundamentally, oxygen is what drives the body. So DO stands for the delivery of oxygen, and that's based on the carrying capacity of oxygen and the cardiac output. So we won't talk too much about the carrying capacity of your body, but that's your arterial oxygen content, and that's dependent on the hemoglobin, which is the molecule that's obviously transporting your oxygen, how saturated that hemoglobin molecule is, which is your saturation of arterial oxygen, and the partial pressure of oxygen. And that's the pressure gradient of oxygen. It really tells you how well is oxygen diffusing across the alveolar membrane. We've got a little alveoli here. Oxygen is going to diffuse across and into the blood cell, into the bloodstream. And so there's a big difference between SaO2 and PaO2. SaO2 is a saturation. So we call that SAT. So you can only get 100% with the saturation. Versus PaO2, that's like how much oxygen can be pushed in the bloodstream. So that can be well above 100. But typically supposed to be a little bit of but for the purposes of this lecture, we're really going to focus on the cardiac output and the components of cardiac output. The cardiac output is made up of the volume and the heart rate. So for the heart rate, and we'll go into the three components that make up the heart volume. Those three components are the preload, which is typically regulated by the volume. The afterload is regulated by calcium receptors, preload and alpha-1, and the contractility, which is regulated by a beta-1 receptor. Remember, beta-1 equals beta heart. So, beta-1 receptors. So what is cardiac output? It's the amount of blood ejected from the ventricle in 1 minute, and it measures the amount of blood delivered to the body per minute. Indirectly, we believe that that correlates to the amount of oxygen delivered to the body. And we again have our representation, cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. So heart rate. Heart rate is regulated by the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. So the sympathetic nervous system, that's your fight or flight system. And we've got norepinephrine as our major neurotransmitter here. So sympathetic nerve is going to release norepinephrine. It's going to bind to that beta-1 receptor. We're going to get G-coupled protein reactions, which increases CAMP. That's going to, in turn, increase the amount of calcium that comes into the cell. And as a result, we get an increase in contraction. On the flip side, so that's the contraction part of beta-1. On the other side of things, beta-1 also increases the heart rate by increasing the firing rate through a change in the electron membrane potential of your typical pacer cells, and so our heart rate goes up. So norepinephrine has two effects. We get an increase in contraction and an increase in heart rate here, all through that beta-1 receptor. On the flip side, the parasympathetic system is your relaxation system. And so this is regulated by the vagus nerve. And I always like to remember this song from The Lion King that Elton John sings, which is like something about kings and vagabonds. You know the song. We'll find it. We'll sing it in class. Anyway, the vagabond, the word vagabond, vaga itself is a Latin derivative, and it means slow and wandering. So vagabond is like that dude, like with a stick and, like a little satchel, and he's hopping on trains and he's wandering all over the country. To me, that's a vagabond. And so I think of the vagus nerve as being the vagabond of the body, because the vagus nerve comes down from the brain and it innervates all of your organs. So you get a slowing down of all of your organs. So your vagus nerve is the nerve that comes in and counteracts the sympathetic nervous system, and its receptor, or its neurotransmitter is going to be acetylcholine. So acetylcholine gets released, it acts on the muscarinic receptor, and that drives your heart rate down over time. This is why the drug atropine, which is an anticholinergic, helps to fight against a low heart rate. So if you think of the vagus nerve as applying the brakes to your heart rate, atropine is blocking the brakes. And so if people have low heart rates, you'll often see us give atropine to try to bring that heart rate back up again. Okay, so now we're moving on to the stroke volume side of things. So remember we said stroke volume was predicated on a couple different functions. We had preload, we had afterload, and we had contractility. And you'll see that preload takes place, if you look at the heart here, I'll just label this for us. This is probably my favorite way to represent the heart, because it just gives you the perfect circle of what's really happening. If you think about it as a circle, it's much more easy to understand. So here we've got veins that are bringing blood back. So veins are bringing blood back from the heart, back from the body. We enter into the right atrium. We go down tricuspid into the right ventricle. Out the pulmonic valve, or the pulmonary artery, where we pick up oxygen. Where it's oxygenated, it comes back to the left atrium. And through our mitral valve to the left ventricle. At the aortic valve to the aorta, and then down to the body, where the body extracts the O2 out of the blood. And so we'll see SaO2, which is measured over here on the arterial side of things. You'll see something called the SvO2, the saturation of venous oxygen. And I'm pointing this out because later we'll talk about why we care about SvO2 when it comes to sepsis. And that's going to be based on the oxygen extraction that occurs in the body itself. So we'll come back to that. Let's take a look at preload first. So preload is technically considered a stretch. That stretch is caused by returning blood from your body. So as this blood comes back to the right side of the heart, it fills the right side of the heart and begins to stretch your ventricle. So when it creates that stretch, that's what preload is. And so we measure the pressure that's generated inside this space here, and we use this pressure to estimate a volume. And it's very important to understand that technically we're using pressure to measure volume because they're not the same thing, right? We assume that as the pressure goes up, an increase in pressure relates to an increase in volume. But it is possible that an increase in pressure might not be related to volume, and that's where our patients' past medical history is really important. Let's say you had a really restricted heart, and so you weren't able to stretch in this area. So you had a very tiny space to fill. Well, a small amount of volume would generate a very large pressure if that was the case. So if you knew that somebody had a very restrictive cardiomyopathy, rather than a dilated cardiomyopathy, you would know that you might not be getting a very accurate representation when you measure that pressure. So how do we measure that pressure? We've got two methods of measuring that pressure. We have a measurement called the CVP, or the central venous pressure. And that comes in right before the right atrium And that's a measurement of the pressure of the venous system that's returning. And then we have the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. I'll write that up here. Pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. Now that one is incredibly helpful for us because really what we need to do in order to get a pulmonary capillary wedge pressure is we need to use what's called a PA catheter or pulmonary artery catheter. And what happens with the use of that catheter, let me just erase some of this stuff here. When we use a pulmonary artery catheter, we snake that catheter in through the subclavian vein, and it comes down through the right atrium, through the valve, through the right ventricle, and up into the pulmonary artery. And there's a little balloon that sits at the end of this. When we blow that balloon up, we occlude this pulmonary artery right here. Now all of a sudden there's a block right here. And so if you think about what happens during diastole, which is the slow filling of the heart. During diastole, this valve is closed and this valve is closed because we're allowing blood to come in and fill the heart from here. We're allowing blood to come in and fill the heart from here. And we want the heart to remain full. So during diastole, as you'll notice, I've just proved that this whole portion of the heart is open. And it's also completely open all the way back to the edge of our balloon. So a PA catheter, or the pulmonary artery catheter, or sometimes a wedge pressure because we wedge the balloon into the pulmonary artery, and we can, by doing so, when we measure the pressure here, we're measuring the pressure inside this entire system, from the aortic valve into the left ventricle, into the left atrium, all the way back through the pulmonary vasculature. So a pulmonary artery catheter gives us a pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, and that gives us an idea of the pressure that's happening over here on the left side of the heart. So a CVP is going to give us really a measurement of what's happening on the filling side of the right side of the heart. A PA catheter is going to give us information about what's happening on the left side of the heart. Now you'll notice that this catheter that we're placing, the PA catheter, is going through two different valves and it will all the way up and over to here. So that's incredibly intolerable for the heart. And so we've really fallen out of favor of using the PA catheter because by threading it through all these valves, we actually tend to cause a lot of arrhythmias. And some of the potential complications of this is if you thread it too forcefully, instead of it making this kind of U-turn and going back up and out, people have often hooked right through the heart and caused a hole in the heart instead. And so that can be pretty life-threatening because now all of a sudden you've got blood coming out of your heart in the wrong spot. So we don't use PA catheters very often, but they are very helpful because they give us an idea of what's happening over here and it's about to go out to the body. And as we learn, they give us a lot more information as well. So they're very common in cardiac patients since we need to really have a good idea of what's going on. Whereas a CVP is really common in just your basic ICU patient, where all we want to know is what volume is coming back. Okay, so that was a lot. That's what this slide pretty much explains right here. So you'll see that in diastole, we've got all of these open, and that's measured as a wedge pressure. And we've got our normals here. And so the normal wedge pressure is anywhere between 12 to 18. And the normal CVP is actually fairly low, between 0 and 4. So you'll see when people are septic, we're often targeting anywhere between 6 to 8, sometimes higher, though. New literature is coming out to say that we probably are giving too much fluid. Okay, so that's preload. Now, one of the important things to know about preload, the fundamental principle behind it, is the Frank-Starling physiology curve. And so Frank-Starling, if you kind of remember way back in physiology, basically said that a muscle will contract with an equal amount of force relative to how much it's been stretched. And so what that means is that in a normal person, as we increase the pressure and move this way by increasing pressure inside our ventricle, we get a fairly proportional increase in the volume, right? So if we go from here to here, we get a fairly large increase in the volume that's going to be coming out. That's because we've increased the pressure, which means we increase the stretch. And so that contraction is going to be that much more strong, and we're going to eject that much more blood out. Now, one of the problems, though, is that when you're in heart failure, you lose your Frank-Starling curve. We call it a flattening of the curve. And so instead, when you move this far, instead of getting the normal amount of volume out, you only get you get a much smaller amount of volume. So you lose that responsiveness to that pressure. So as the pressure increases, you're not expelling nearly as much volume. The heart has failed. Your muscle isn't very strong. So even though we stretch it the same amount, it cannot generate that force to get that volume out. And that is the classic sign of heart failure, is that you have this flattened curve. And you'll notice that as we progress, it gets to a point where it doesn't matter how much you really increase your pressure, pretty much flat. You don't get any additional response. And that's where we begin to see that patients start to get into volume overload and things like that. So that's the Frank-Starling curve. We'll come back to that when we talk about heart failure. The next component to stroke volume is going to be afterload. And afterload is technically defined as the wall tension during contraction necessary to expel ventricular volume into the aorta. Well, we don't know what the heck that means word-wise, so how can I not put that? Okay, sorry guys. Let me draw afterload real quick, and then we'll do contractility. So in a tiny little square over here, we're going to do afterload. So really, when I think about afterload, I think of, I've got my left ventricle here, and my aorta is going to come out of my left ventricle, right? Here's your aorta. And you've got your aortic valve here. And so when you have a contraction, your left ventricle is going to squeeze inward, and it's going to pop open that valve, like generating force. So the force of the contraction pushes the volume, that volume pushes against the valve pops open, and blood expels into the aorta. So we call afterload is the pressure that your left ventricle needs to pump against. So afterload is really the force that's pushing back to keep that valve closed. And so your left ventricle has to overcome the afterload in order to pump that valve open. So you can see that as your aorta constricts, it's going to increase the afterload. So vasoconstriction increases afterload. And vasodilation, by counterpart, you dilate. Now you've got a bigger aorta, there's less pressure. Vasodilation leads to a decrease in your afterload. And so, which receptors tend to regulate vasoconstriction, vasodilation? Well, our alpha-1 receptor is very significantly affected. They're very significantly affected. We also know that our angiotensin II pathway causes vasoconstriction. And so this is why we're using ACE inhibitors, because they're going to inhibit the angiotensin II pathway and cause vasodilation, drop your blood pressure. For those of you who take the angiotensin infusion drug as your topic, this is sort of the target here in terms of increasing blood pressure is that angiotensin II pathway. Okay, so that's afterload, and we can talk about it at the end of the how vasoconstricted or vasodilated. So afterload is alpha-1 angiotensin, A's go together, and it's arterial. Afterload, arterial, alpha-1, angiotensin. Contractility, and ionotropy, is the last factor, and that's the one that we don't have the best measurement for. There's nothing that's directly measuring contractility, but we can infer it based on your pressure volume curves. What we're really talking about when we're talking about contractility is the ability of your heart to contract. So, if you have heart failure, you have a very poor contractility for your heart, and that's what we're very mentioned, it doesn't contract. And so, the sort of indirect measurement that I think of when I think of contractility then is going to be ejection fraction, because that's going to tell me how efficient my heart is at putting volume out. And so, we want ejection fraction, so generally go to 45% or so. 45 to 50% is a pretty good preserved ejection fraction. As we begin to lower our ejection fraction, that's when we start to see some of the complications of heart failure. And so, again, glucagon receptors are required for contractility to occur, and we will do them in the sympathetic nerve center. So, when we're walking through a patient and trying to do this genetic assessment, I like to think, what are the three things that could be wrong in here? I'm going to start with the 3-year-old. So if I gave them fluid, would their cardiac output increase? And that's really asking, what is the fluid? Then I start asking, okay, is their arterial vasomotor tone increased? Are they vasoconstricted? Are they vasodilated or normal? What's their afterload? And then the last question you're going to ask is, can the heart sustain a cardiac output if I were to change my afterload? So if I had a really poor heart and I vasoconstricted, let's try the left ventricle again. And here's our aorta coming out. And if I had a really, really weak heart, and I vasoconstricted my aorta and my arteries as a whole, so I increased the afterload here. Well, it's going to be really, really hard for my heart to generate enough pressure to pop those valves open if I'm in heart failure. So afterload in a heart failure patient is fundamentally one of the most detrimental things that could possibly happen, because that heart cannot overcome the afterload. And so this is why in heart failure, so much of our targets is decreasing afterload because there's vasodilators and things like that. So this question here, can the heart sustain cardiac output if vasomotor tones are restored? That's really asking, would they tolerate a vasopressor? Or is that going to put them in a heart failure? If I were to squeeze down to try to increase their blood pressure, is that going to do more harm than good? Okay, so what happens when you have hemodynamic instability? Obviously we want blood pressure, but the question is kind of why? Well, as we said, oxygen drives the body, and delivering that oxygen is critical. And so if we do not get oxygen delivered, we get organ injury, death. You'll see something called shock liver a lot. There's always one of my students, and you see a septic patient. They have AST and ALTs to be in thousands, 4,000. 4,000, 5,000. That's huge. They're not in acute liver failure. Remember, AST and ALT is a sign of damage, right? This septic person stopped perfusing their liver for a period of time, and the hepatocytes freaked out, and as they begin to become injured or die due to lack of oxygen, they release their ASTs and ALTs, and it begins to creep up. Similarly, if you can't perfuse your kidneys, you can't feed what you don't see, you see renal failure. We often see confusion as a component of brain dysfunction because we're not getting enough blood to the brain. So, increased lactate due to anaerobic respiration. This is being an indirect marker of shock. And actually, we talk about the Q surface score now, including lactate or an SpO2 as possible measurement of shock because it's so helpful. So, lactate. If you're not getting oxygen to your body will put anaerobic respiration. And the byproduct of anaerobic respiration is lactate. So the higher the lactate, the longer you've been hyperperfused. And then SpO2, a decrease in SpO2, might be a sign that your body is starved for oxygen. So remember, we talked about the left ventricle feeding blood to the body, and then that blood came back to the right atrium and the right ventricle. And that blood into the lungs, and that blood came back to the left atrium and the left ventricle. And we said we measured the SaO2 over here, the evaporation in the arterial side of oxygen. We can measure SvO2 over here on the venous side. And so if we look at the difference between these two, if our SvO2, so this, let's say we started at 100%. Our lungs are working great, we're able to get oxygen into the bloodstream. That oxygen hits our body, and usually about 30% of it is extracted. So our SvO2 that's returning is usually at about a 70% saturation. But if we see that our SvO2 begins to tank, and now it's like 50%, that means that our body is taking out way more oxygen than it previously did. And that's going to be a high extraction state. And so that's a sign that we've hyperperfused the body and our tissues are oxygen needed and really pulling tons of oxygen out. So you'll see SvO2 as a marker for us because we can pull it off the venous side and we can sort of make some inferences regarding the difference between the SvO2 and the SaO2. So that's what the SvO2 is here. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the types of shock. We're kind of transitioning into the next half of the presentation. So there's 4 types of shock that we typically talk about: cardiogenic, distributive, hypovolemic, and obstructive. The cardiogenic, that's going to be heart failure, it's a compensated heart failure. Distributive is usually like septic shock. Technically, anaphylaxis falls under distributive shock, but the treatment is very, very different, so we won't go there. Hypovolemic is going to be a hemorrhagic type of a shock that you feel about. Typically post-op, so surgeons are going to be seeing that. And obstructive is going to be caused by cardiac tamponade. And in that case, you've got this, you might have seen it in one of your videos. So, you guys hear that right now? My dog is all right, so cardiac tamponade, that was in one of the videos that I showed you, where you've got your heart and it's in this pericardial sac here. And if that sac fills up with fluid, then all of a sudden your heart cannot expand to fill with blood anymore. And you reach this sort of, and so you lose your ability to fill your heart with blood, and therefore you lose the ability to expel any blood, and so you fall cardiac output as a result. So that's cardiac tamponade. It's one of the T's in the H's and T's for PEAS. Okay, so cardiogenic shock. I won't spend much time on this since you guys have already had heart failure in therapeutics. But remember, heart failure is a failure of the pumping mechanism. So usually you have a decrease in cardiac output. When that happens, the decrease in cardiac output results in a lower blood pressure, and so your body increases your renin-angiotensin system to try to vasoconstrict and maintain perfusion. This is a compensatory mechanism. Unfortunately, your body doesn't realize that this compensatory mechanism is counterproductive because its heart is broken. So when we increase our vasoconstriction, when we vasoconstrict, then we sort of increase our afterload. Because we have such a high afterload, the work on the heart it's going to increase the work of the heart, and so the heart can also be able to pump as much blood out because it's not strong enough to overcome all of that after that volume begins to back up in the left ventricle. It's going to back up, and you're going to get pulmonary edema. It backs all the way up. And eventually we get what looks like an elevated preload because we've got too much volume in our body. If we're not able to get blood out of the heart, that means that blood can't go to the kidneys, we can't clear volume out of the body, and so you get a volume overload state. So this is the sort of the cycle of cardiogenic shock. And it all starts with this decreased cardiac output. So just to show it again here, as you get vasoconstriction in response to a low cardiac output, this vasoconstriction means it's much, much, much harder to get blood out of the left ventricle because our heart's not pumping as much. So that blood gets stuck here. We've got less blood being ejected, so we have a lower ejection fraction. If the blood backs up here, you're going to see it back up here. All that blood backs up to the lungs, you're going to see pulmonary edema. That blood can back up even further, and you start to see just this overall excess preload or excess volume status in that patient. Also, since no blood is coming out here, remember part of the organ system would be a kidney, where we'd be able to get some of that fluid out. But if we stop perfusing the kidney and you start to get into renal failure due to your heart failure, it's a vicious cycle. So here you can see there's so many causes of heart failure. Supraventricular arrhythmias, you're going to see with this SVT, respiratory failure, PE, mechanical ventilation, heart block. The most common one is going to be ischemia. So a malignant arrhythmia, that might be VTAC or VFib, which we're going to look at in our codes. We already talked about tamponade. So there's a ton of reasons that it could happen. What you want to do is look at your patient's past medical history and see which of these is the most likely cause. When we talk heart failure, we should have covered this in therapeutics, but we'll do it really quickly. We use this sort of classification of warm and dry, warm and wet, cold and dry, cold and wet. So we've got a wedge pressure down here, and remember wedge pressure is a preload measurement, and preload measures volume. So as we go this way, we've got more volume. And as we go this way, there's less volume. Thus the dry versus the wet. And then we've got our cardiac index here, which is sort of an index measure of output. And so as our cardiac index goes up, we're able to generate a nice cardiac output, so we have good contractility. So we're well perfused from nice and warm. And as our cardiac index drops, we've got low contractility, and we're not able to get the blood out of the heart, and therefore we don't perfuse the body very well. We become cold. So you get this sort of dynamic setup here. So, in terms of treatment, if you're warm and wet, the problem here is that you've got wet, you've got too much volume. We're looking at diuretics. Vasodilators can also help us pull some of the fluid on the venous side of the body while we're working on getting it out. If you're cold and dry, well, if you're dry, you typically need volume to get you back out. So we're going to give you little bits of volume, 250 to 500 ml at a time, and watch your blood pressure come up. And then you're going to get to the point where it doesn't come up anymore, and we reached our volume target. And so if we still need more, then we're going to help increase contractility, which is an ionotrope. Remember, we said contractility is regulated by the beta-1 receptor, and ionotropes target the beta-1 receptor. And then lastly, if you're both cold and wet, we're going to get ionotropes going first because we have to perfuse the body first. So ionotropes are going to help us move up in this direction. Once we get up here and we're perfusing, now we got to get the volume up. So we might use the thyroid this thing. So sometimes it's counterintuitive because you're going to see somebody on a pressor, what we call a pressor, or really it's an ionotrope. You're going to see somebody on something for blood pressure and getting diuresis at the same time, which seems counterintuitive, but if we're in that cold and wet status, it's really the only way to help get that fluid off. You have to get blood to the kidneys to get those diuretics and get the fluid off. So for cardiogenic shock, this is what we typically see for hemodynamic coordinators. You're going to see an increase in your pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. We've got too much volume on board. You're going to see an increase in your SVR. That's a measurement of your outflow. Should have mentioned that. And you're going to see a decrease in your cardiac output. And so these are going to be our targets for each one of these. Now remember, our primary problem is that our cardiac output is low. We're going to target this one first. The next type of shock we have is distributive shock, sometimes called septic shock. Now these are my sepsis stairs of death, and it's technically been reclassified, so we don't have these classifications anymore, but it is really helpful in terms of understanding the premise of what's happening in sepsis to get it this way. We do sepsis in class, we'll talk about some of the new stuff in sepsis, but sepsis starts with SIRS, or systemic inflammatory response syndrome, where you need greater than 2 of the following criteria: temperature, heart rate, respiratory rate, and red blood cell count. So I sort of remember it as I can take these 3 while I'm laying at home in bed feeling sick. And so if I'm meeting any 2 of the 3, I've got SIRS at a minimum. Unfortunately, I can't check my red cell count. I wish I could. So if you have SIRS and then signs of an infection, a cough, thick, copious sputum, flank pain that might indicate a kidney infection, burning urination, that's going to be sepsis. So right off the bat, that's sepsis. I'm willing to bet all of us have probably sort of met some of this criteria before we went to the doctor. Once you progress, you've got sepsis, and now we start to see organ dysfunction, where we see an increase in our serum creatinine, or an increase in LFTs, or T-bili. You might see an increase in the lactate here. This is where we're starting to see our organs are not functioning very well. That's severe sepsis. And then notice septic shock. Shock only happens only when we begin to see a change in our blood pressure. So shock goes with low blood pressure, and it is severe sepsis, and finally we begin to see a blood pressure change. So I call it like a decompensated state, because there's no blood pressure changes for severe sepsis, but there's blood pressure changes for septic shock. So how do we manage sepsis? There's not a ton of controversy. There's just a lot of different ways to do it. But it all started with this guy named Manny Rivers in 2001. He really protocolized the approach to sepsis management, and that's really what we push now, is a protocolized approach. Meaning, you pick targets and you work through a protocol to meet your targets no matter what. And his approach was to start with fluid, because he wanted to fill the tank up with fluid first. Once you're full of fluid, then you start a vasopressor to try to increase the blood pressure further, because you're going to reach a point where fluid no longer increases pressure. Then you start your pressor. If you're still hyperperfused and your SVO2 is still low, that's when we start doing things to try to increase the carrying capacity by transfusing blood, very infrequently done, or starting something that's going to help with contractility, like an ionotrope. So this was Manny Rivers' protocol. It ended up showing a fairly significant decrease in mortality, which is one of the first studies published that decreased sepsis mortality. It was widely adopted all over the place. And we've got all kinds of trials that have come out now to really look at does this, their strict protocol makes sense versus a more looser interpretation based on physiology. And it's sort of the take home is as long as you're following something and it's targeted to patient goals and your volume necessitated, you tend to have decent outcomes. So what's going wrong in distributive shock? Well, in distributive shock or sepsis, right, it's an infection. Your body has released tons of cytokines, and those cytokines are supposed to be vasodilating the blood vessels so that blood cells can get to the area. But unfortunately, it's doing it all over your body instead of just in the targeted area of the infection. So you become profoundly vasodilated. And when you do that, you open up the tight junctions in your capillaries, and you get very leaky capillaries. So all of your volume starts to leak out. We have a pretty low blood pressure or low volume. We have a very low SVR because we're vasodilated. And our cardiac output, initially, our heart rate goes up a lot because we're trying to compensate. So this is a compensated cardiac output. And all of this is being driven by that infection. It's causing vasodilation. So really, this is going to be our primary target here, the SVR or our alpha rate. So we're going to be targeting our alpha-1 receptors in this case. Last would be hypovolemic shock that we'll talk about. So hypovolemic shock is blood loss. We already did a hypovolemic shock, like hemorrhagic shock already, so I won't spend too much time on this, but for the most part, your body can compensate kind of to about 25%. Once you get beyond 25%, that's when you really see your respiratory rate becomes significantly increased. You lose our urine output, you become confused, your heart rate's like really over 120. So that's sort of our differentiating spot for me. We won't spend a ton of time on this. I won't really ask you any hypovolemic shock questions. I'll write it to them. So in hypovolemic shock, as you might imagine, the problem is we have no volume. So that's our primary problem. And so what does our body do? Our body tries to clamp down in response to increase SVR. And we have a low cardiac output because there's nothing to pump, right? You can't pump what's not there. So we have a low cardiac output. Okay, so in summary, for cardiogenic shock, we have an increase in our blood pressure, an increase in the SpO2, and our cardiac output is low, and that's the primary problem. For distributive shock, we have leaky capillaries, we lose all our volume, we're totally vasodilated because of the infection. That's typically our primary problem, and our heart tries to respond to compensate. In hypovolemic shock, we've lost all of our blood volume, we have a low blood pressure, we have an increase in our SVR as a compensation, and we have no cardiac output because there's nothing for us to pump. Okay, so now let's get into the pressures. I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, so beta 1 in the cardiac myocyte is a contraction and an increase in heart rate. Alpha 1 is in the smooth muscle. As they contract, that gives you vasoconstriction. So where are these? As a quick review, we just talked about, your alpha 1 is in the systemic vasculature, the beta 1 is in the cardiac cell. There are beta 1s and 2s in the pulmonary system. This is what beta 2 agonists. There's a dilation here. So typically, I think of like the 2s as the dilators and the 1s as your constrictors. Okay, we already talked about our heart failure classification. Let's talk about the types of ionotropes that we're going to need. We said that if you're in this cold section, you're going to need ionotropes to try to bring you up, and that's going to increase the contractility in your heart. So we're going from a low cardiac index to a high cardiac index. Oh, shoot. Well, I just missed that slide, so I'm going to do it too quickly. But that slide sort of shows you we've got two ionotropes. We have dopamine and dobutamine. This is alpha and this is beta activity. So butyrate is pure beta 1, and dopamine sort of spans the two. So dopamine used to be in separate chakra, it's been removed, don't detect no arrhythmias. The thing about dopamine, I like to say it's dopey because it doesn't know what it's doing. It changes its receptor response based on dose. So low dose, it hits the dopamine receptors. Medium dose, you get beta 1 receptors. And then high dose is alpha 1 receptors. This can be incredibly difficult to figure out where you are in your dosing spectrum here. And I'm not a particular fan of dopamine, simply because you don't really have a lot of receptor specificity, so it's hard to really target what it is that you want. On the flip side, the butamine is a synthetic catecholamine. It's beta only, so beta 1 and beta 2, but preferentially that beta 1 receptor. And the one down, so the butamine is great for cardiogenic shock because it's going to really specifically target contractility. However, because it's hitting that beta 1 receptor so significantly, your heart rate is also going to go up. And so if your heart rate is going up and the squeezing potential of the heart is going up, it really increases myocardial oxygen demand. Your heart is really working hard. So if somebody has ongoing chest pain, the butamine is probably not the best drug of choice for them. The other thing is because it's hitting that beta 1 receptor so hard, you get a lot of ventricular arrhythmias because it's just like bam, 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 bam. So I've seen this, and I've recommended that we take people off of butamine when they start running, having multiple runs of VTAC. That starts to get a little concerning, and usually we'll have to switch them over to something else. So vasodilators, when we're talking about cardiogenic shock, remember vasodilators help us move from warm and wet to warm and dry. There's the top of the box. And what they do is they decrease your systemic vascular resistance. So that means they decrease afterload. And they can decrease preload by dilating the veins. If you think about your veins completely dilating, all that blood is going to sit in those veins, not going to come back to the heart. And your heart's going to have a chance to be operating with a little less volume in it. And that gives you the chance to really start increasing its output rate. So our two most common ones are nitroglycerin and nitroprusside. You'll notice they differ significantly in their max dose. Nitroglycerin is not a very potent medication. Titrating by 5 every 3 to 5 minutes, and we've got a huge range here. Versus nitroprusside, our starting dose is tiny, 0.25 micrograms per kilogram per minute, and our max is about 2. There's not a lot of room in this dosing regimen. It's a very potent drug. Now, when you look in the package insert, it will tell you 10. That is an absurd amount of nitroprusside. Most places I've seen have only ever gone up to about 2, maybe 3. And that's just because the drug comes with so many risks, which we'll review in a second. So what do the vasodilators do? Nitroprusside and nitroglycerin both cause an increase in nitric oxide. Nitric oxide causes relaxation. Relaxation is going to vasodilate these veins. And so all that blood is going to pool over here, and you're going to get a decrease in preload. So in heart failure, this is helpful because we're falling over. Okay. So we like relaxation. The nitroglycerin, it's organic, preferentially vasodilates veins. It can get really, really high up into the arteries, but that's the big distinction. Nitroglycerin is mostly venous. The other thing that's important about it is that you can develop tolerance, which is why we always have that nitrate-free period. So we're really only looking for nitroglycerin for like 2 days or so for treatment. The nice thing about it is it can be used to decrease myocardial oxygen demand. So if you have somebody who's having chest pain, nitroglycerin is a great choice. Nitroprusside, as we said, is way more potent, and this is going to relax both the arteries and the veins. So you get a decrease in afterload because the arteries and a decrease in preload. So that's a nice feature. The downside to this is that it gets metabolized to cyanide, which is not good. So cyanide can be it's excreted by the kidneys, and so the risks of toxicity are really at those high rates of nitroglycerin for longer periods of time. And because cyanide is excreted at the kidneys, a patient with renal failure would have a very strong concentration to be getting a large dose of nitric oxide. You can still give a small amount for a very short period of time, but I would be very, very hesitant. And so sodium thiosulfate, that's kind of in the back pocket as a treatment for cyanide toxicity, but in all honesty, it would be very bad practice to give somebody cyanide toxicity through your medication. So you really want to avoid this. Anytime I see nitric oxide, I'm like racing up the floor to find out how long it's been on, talk to the nurses, check the renal function, and make sure the team's aware that we have probably a limited amount of time using this drug. So that wraps up the ionotropes. The next group of drugs are going to be our pressors. And so our pressors are really looking at alpha-1 activity for the most part, with phenylephrine, which is all alpha-1, norepinephrine, which splits the 2, and epinephrine, which splits the 2 as well, but got a lot more beta-1 potency, so that's why you see it and shift it down a little bit. So these pluses are they're kind of arbitrary. They're just sort of like a qualitative measure. I went crazy in residency trying to figure out like what is a 4 mean versus 3, and it's just telling you sort of like the relative potency of each of these. So phenylephrine, as I said, it's a pure alpha-1 agonist, so complete vasoconstriction of the arteries, which is great for afterload increase, great for sepsis. When you're completely vasodilated, you want to clamp you down. If you've got heart failure, though, the last thing that you want to do is try to clamp you down and push you afterload, because that's just going to tank your cardiac output. So the benefit of phenylephrine really is place in therapy. It has no effect on the heart rate or the contractility because there's no beta-1 activity. So as you'll see with norepinephrine and epinephrine, because they have some beta activity, we can drive that heart rate up a little bit. So if somebody's on norepi for sepsis, which is our first-line agent, and their heart rate starts to get up in the 110s, 120s, you'll see us back off the norepinephrine and add phenylephrine on board to try to just get lots of alpha-1 activity here. So when you see phenylephrine, you should be thinking septic. Norepinephrine, as I said, it's got alpha-1 and 2, and it's going to have that effect on heart rate. And so it's helpful for us in a couple different ways. We can increase our SVR, we can increase contractility, considered essentially the first-line agent for septic shock. You'll see this a lot. There's been some head-to-head trials, very few actually, pressure head-to-head trials. There's a head-to-head trial of norepinephrine versus dopamine. Neither was better, but dopamine had more side effects, and that's why it's been pulled out of the guidelines. Oh, epinephrine. I can't go back. Sorry, guys. But epi is really the most potent of them all, and epi has alpha and beta. At low doses, it's mostly beta, which is used for contractility. And we like to say that epinephrine gives you more contractility for the heart rate bump. So if you had somebody on butamine for the beta receptor, and epinephrine for its beta activity, and you had a heart rate of 100 with each of them, you can get more contractility out of the epinephrine with butamine. So this is how we titrate. Notice again, phenylephrine, we're starting at 20 to 20, or 25 to 50. We're titrating by 25, but we've got a max range of 300 to 400. So this tells you a lot about the potency of the medication. Not very potent. We've got fairly large 25 dose change, and we've got this really wide range here. So you've got a lot of dose changes in the epinephrine. And I go over that because thinking about your starting dose, your titration, and your max helps you really understand the drug's properties a lot more. Versus norepinephrine and epinephrine. The norepinephrine, there's two different ways to dose this. You can go multiple kilos per minute, or you can go mics per minute. So norepinephrine, it's hard to see because of that much per minute as I matched over here. Typically, we're starting at like 2 micrograms per minute for our norepinephrine dose. We're titrating by about 2 micrograms per minute, and our max is 20. Compare that to epinephrine, which starts at 2 micrograms per minute and maxes out at 12. So that's going to tell you epi is much more potent than norepinephrine, and phenylephrine is the potent. All right, so now we've got the last couple are some of our weirder ones. Milrinone is a phosphodiesterase inhibitor. It's probably one of my favorite drugs, just because it's got such an interesting, unique mechanism of action. So phosphodiesterase, PDE3, is responsible for the breakdown of cyclic AMP. And so let's take a look at what this mechanism looks like. So normally you've got epinephrine binding to the beta-1 receptor, a beta agonist. It's going to increase your CAMP. An increase in CAMP, we said, leads to ultimately an increase in contractility. When you give a phosphodiesterase inhibitor, well, so then phosphodiesterase breaks down CAMP and the contractility returns to normal. So if we give a phosphodiesterase inhibitor, we're going to prolong the activity of CAMP and therefore prolong the contractility because we're not breaking that CAMP down very much. So that's the mechanism of milrinone. The nice thing is that because it's not directly acting on the beta-1 agonist, you can use it with a beta-1 agonist. So you might see dobutamine plus milrinone, or epi at a low dose for that beta-1 effect plus milrinone. So that's nice. It's also helpful in the heart failure patients who, let's say they were completely compliant and they took 200 milligrams in overall extended release and then went into heart failure. Well, we can hit them with a lot of beta-1 agonists, but they're going to be beta blockaded for at least 24 hours. So milrinone becomes a great drug of choice here because we can increase contractility without having to use the beta-1 receptor. So we consider it to be synergistic. It helps us use lower doses of the rest of our drugs, which is nice. And then it's got some other effects in the lungs, which is also incredibly helpful. We won't go into it. That's a pretty high level hemodynamics. So that's milrinone. I like it. Pretty cool. It's renally eliminated, but we don't really dose reduce it. We're titrating to effect. The only thing that I'll think about is because it's renally eliminated, it does have a very long half-life, about 3 to 5 hours. So your titrating up and down should be very slow because it's going to take a long time, remember 3 to 5 times the half-life, to get steady state. So every time you change the dose, it's going to take a couple hours for you to get to the new accumulated steady state. So this is not a drug where we're titrating every couple of minutes. We're titrating every couple of hours or so. And if it's renally eliminated, remember that it's going to accumulate much more, so you want to be sure that your titrations aren't overly aggressive. The last one we'll talk about then is vasopressin. Vasopressin is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and binds the vasopressin receptors and causes vasoconstriction. The way that we tend to use vasopressin is we use it in very, very small doses, 0.04 units per hour. If you were to use it as a bolus, the old school ACLS guidelines used vasopressin 40 units as a bolus, which is a lot compared to 0.04. So this would cause massive vasoconstriction, where you think of that as you're using it in a code, you want as much as you can possibly get. What we've discovered is that if we give very low doses continuously as a standard dose, it actually can increase your vascular muscle cell sensitivity to other pressors. So there was a vast study that looked at continuously infusing vasopressin with norepinephrine. So vaso plus norepi versus just norepinephrine alone. And it found that this group up here had lower overall norepinephrine doses than this group. And so the postulation was that vasopressin was acting synergistically with norepinephrine, just at that fixed dose. So in summary, sort of what you want to take away from this is think about which problem is your primary problem. If pulmonary capillary blood pressure is your primary problem, none of your pressors are going to fix it. You're going to need volume. You're going to want to do crystalloids to bring up the volume. If your afterload, your SVR, is your problem, that means that, usually it's going to be vasodilation. Then we want to think of things that are going to increase the SVR. And so typically, vasodilation, that's our primary problem in sepsis. And you see we've got norepinephrine and phenylephrine being the two most potent. And those are consistent with when we tend to use them. Norepinephrine first, and then phenylephrine later. Lastly, if cardiac output is your primary problem, then contractility is your issue. And that's going to be associated with cardiogenic shock or heart failure. And we're going to be looking for things that are very potent increasers of cardiac output. Those are going to be things that hit your beta-1 receptor pretty significantly. And that's fairly consistent. Remember, epinephrine has a lot of beta-1 activity, so does dobutamine. Remember, milrinone is an adjunctive therapy, phosphodiesterase inhibitor. And dopamine is an option, but it's not the best option. All right. So that is the quick summary of hemodynamics, the physiology behind it, and how to pick your pressure. So really that's what it ultimately comes down to, is you walk up to your patient, first question is, why is their blood pressure low? Is it due to a volume problem, an afterload problem, or a contractility problem? Once you know that answer, then you can pick the right pressor. So that's why the physiology always comes first, and understanding what's causing that physiology and what's driving it, and then you manipulate your receptor to get the result that you want. The end.